They found the diligent service at the edge of the hadron expanse, drifting in a perfect holding pattern that no living hand had programmed. The battle fleet patrol vessel hung intact in the void, her hull unmarked by battle damage, her reactor core humming with steady devotion to the Omnissiah. Every system functioned within sacred tolerances, every corridor remained pressurized and lit, every chronometer marked time that mattered to no one aboard. The ship was empty. Captain Voss of the salvage frigate Redemptive led the boarding party through airlocks that cycled with mechanical precision. Inside, the air tasted of copper and lingering incense. Mess tables were laid for the next watch, meals half-finished and cooling. Personal effects remained undisturbed in crew quarters. The ship's bells had been rung on schedule, their cords showing the oils of 100 hands that no longer existed. In the Vox compartment, Lieutenant Caney's voice repeated the same phrase every 13 seconds. "Emperor, protect us from the storm's eye." The recording was clean, professional, as if reciting routine liturgy. But the machine's spirit had become a translator. The same prayer bled through in High Gothic, in Port Wonder Dockside cant, and in a Dead Hive dialect from Carthax Secundus, a world the diligent service had never orbited. The crew spoke in tongues they had never learned. The navigator's sanctum told its own story. Curtain veils hung heavy with sacred unguents dried hard along their seams. On oiled wood, a notation marked a course correction at the storm margin, then another line that bent away from the Astronomican's light before being scratched out. The ink had bled in a way that suggested the writer's eyes watered. Beside the star charts, 3 words were carved into the meditation bench. The Watching. Gellerfield readings remained clean. No cavitation scars marked the hull, no slick places where unreality had licked the deck plates. The field generators cycled through their maintenance routines with machine spirit devotion. Standing orders on the bridge referenced the 7-hour protocol, highlighted and signed by the captain's hand 2 days prior. The classification appeared in naval directives without explanation, a procedural ghost haunting Imperial documentation. This discovery marked the 43rd vessel recovered in similar condition across Segmentum Obscurus in the past decade, each ship intact, each crew vanished, each broadcasting warnings in languages that grew increasingly unfamiliar as the recordings progressed. The pattern had earned classification as Incident Type Sigma 7, though few officers possessed clearance to access the full documentation. The truth emerging from these silent hulks challenges fundamental assumptions about warp storm survival. Common wisdom holds that storms consume everything they touch, leaving only twisted wreckage and screams echoing through the immaterium. Ships enter storms and never emerge, their fate as final as a bolt shell to the brain. But evidence tells a different story. Ships do return from warp storms. The mystery is not why no one returns, but what happens to those who do. Our investigation requires 3 analytical frameworks. The technical lens examines the machinery of warp transit, Geller field generators that project reality bubbles into unreality, the plasma conduits powering humanity's desperate attempt to impose order on chaos, the machine spirits maintaining delicate balance between existence and annihilation. The human lens focuses on navigator physiology and crew psychology, the biological and mental costs of warp exposure, the coping mechanisms ordinary humans develop to survive repeated contact with impossible realities. The institutional lens reveals the Imperial Navy's response protocols that prioritize containment over rescue, information control over crew welfare. The scale extends from minor tempests claiming individual vessels to the Great Rift itself, the galaxy-spanning wound, bleeding impossibility across half the Imperium. Each storm represents a point where reality fails, where physics bend until they break, where human consciousness encounters truths the mind cannot process without fundamental alteration. Few return from warp storms not because they cannot, but because the Imperium has learned that some survivals are worse than death. The diligent service drifts now in classified quarantine, her corridors sealed, broadcasting her endless warning to those who seek to understand what truly happens when Imperial vessels encounter the storms raging between stars. What is the 7-hour protocol that appears in classified naval directives? Why do some derelicts broadcast warnings in languages their crews never knew? To understand why the diligent service returned empty, yet speaking in phantom tongues, we must examine the machinery that makes such disappearances possible. Warp transit represents less a voyage than a negotiated imbalance, humanity's desperate attempt to impose order on chaos through technology that marries ancient engineering with fervent prayer. The Geller field stands as the Imperium's primary defense against immaterium predation, a reality bubble projected into unreality through sanctified generators positioned at critical structural points throughout every void ship. Plasma conduits channel the vessel's reactor core directly into field projectors, where machine spirits maintain delicate equations between existence and void. Tech priests chant binary hymns that synchronize field harmonics, while servitors monitor fluctuation patterns that would drive unaugmented minds to madness. The field creates what naval doctrine terms a pressure of is against an ocean of might, allowing crew to breathe air that remains air, to walk on decks that maintain consistent orientation, to think thoughts that follow logical progression. But this protection comes with inherent vulnerabilities that Naval Command has learned to manage through ritual and regulation. Upon translation from warp to real space, Geller field generators require 7 hours to achieve full stability. During this critical period, field strength fluctuates in predictable patterns that create windows of opportunity for warp intrusion. The 7-hour protocol emerges from this technical reality, born from statistics rather than superstition, as fleet data show harmonic wobble dampening toward equilibrium between 6 hours, 47 minutes, and 7 hours, 12 minutes after translation. Standard naval procedure during this vulnerability window demands absolute adherence to containment protocols that seem superstitious to uninitiated observers but validate their necessity through casualty statistics. Crew compartments seal according to ancient patterns that follow no logic save effectiveness. Personnel maintains silence disciplines, speaking only when duty requires and never calling shipmates by name lest familiar sounds attract unwanted attention. Mirrors receive shrouding cloths blessed by ship chaplains, preventing reflections from becoming windows to other realities. Eye contact with shadows becomes forbidden. The absence of ritual creates risk vectors. The presence of ritual provides control surfaces against intrusion. At the heart of every vessel capable of warp transit, a navigator reclines in an amniotic throne, pupils fused shut, a third eye that represents both blessing and curse. The Navis Nobilitae call it the gift. Their Medicae describe it more accurately as a lesion that never heals. This genetic mutation, carefully cultivated through millennia of selective breeding programs, allows human consciousness to perceive the Astronomicon through warp storm chaos, where conventional physics collapse into paradox. Navigator houses maintain extensive medical archives documenting the psychological costs of repeated exposure, tracking breakdown patterns that progress from minor temporal displacement to complete reality dissociation. Navigator training begins in childhood with exercises designed to strengthen mental barriers against warp intrusion while maintaining psychic sensitivity required for stellar navigation. Their physiology represents a calculated compromise between human sanity and functional necessity. The third eye sees truths that conventional perception cannot process, requiring constant mental discipline and pain techniques that anchor consciousness to baseline reality. House-breeding programs balance acuity against survivability, for too much sensitivity burns the mind, while insufficient perception leaves ships drifting blind in Imperium currents. Recent Navigator reports describe phenomena that challenge established understanding of warp navigation. During storm transits, experienced navigators report secondary beacons appearing alongside the Astronomican's steady light. These alternative navigation points offer shorter routes through storm systems, promising reduced transit times at costs that remain unspecified in official documentation. Navigator houses mark these intrusions in their charts with veils, notations of respect that read like fear. The beacons appear as kindness that feels like home, an angle that shortens distance through impossible geometries. The psychological toll of routine warp travel manifests in crew turnover statistics that Naval Command treats as operational overhead rather than human tragedy. In the obscurest lanes, median crew churn after 5 voyages rises by 33% above baseline rates. Medical exemption rates for sleep terror, derealization, ritual compulsions, and void sickness climb voyage by voyage in direct correlation with total warp transit time. Veterans become efficient or brittle, sometimes both simultaneously. Rotation schedules claim to protect minds, but in practice merely distribute damage across broader personnel pools. Even successful transits extract their price from human consciousness. Crew members develop coping mechanisms ranging from protective rituals to black market stimulants, promising dreamless sleep during warp passage. They report shared nightmares featuring locations never visited, conversations with individuals never met, knowledge of events occurring on distant worlds. These experiences increase in frequency and intensity with repeated exposure, suggesting cumulative effects that compound across multiple transits in ways that medical documentation struggles to quantify. After secondary beacon corrections, crews display characteristic behavioral modifications. The navigator requests additional opiate, then less, then none at all. Amniotic thrones require extended scrubbing procedures. Petty officers dispose of reflective surfaces. Personnel file for transfers to work involving manual labor where numbers cannot follow them into sleep. The machinery of transit represents humanity's ongoing attempt to impose sanity on madness, but the technology's limitations create vulnerability windows that storm phenomena exploit with apparent intelligence. What do navigators see when they look toward these secondary beacons that promise shortcuts through impossible space? How does prolonged warp exposure progress from discomfort to pathology that transforms loyal Imperial servants into something requiring quarantine protocols? The psychological tolls documented in routine warp transit represent merely the surface symptoms of a far deeper pathology. Imperial Medici archives, cross-referenced with Mechanicus biological surveys across 17 fleet commands, reveal a consistent progression of symptoms that transforms loyal servants of the Emperor into something requiring containment protocols. This is not stress or fatigue, but systematic breakdown of the interface between human consciousness and the raw unreality bleeding through compromised Geller field harmonics. Stage 1 manifests as temporal displacement that begins subtly and escalates beyond rational explanation. Personal chronometers drift from ship's time by seconds, then minutes, despite regular synchronization with the bridge. A rating reports completing his watch twice in the same shift, with clear memories of both experiences. Tools vanish from hands only to reappear in sealed compartments 3 decks away. Condensation runs upward along bulkheads in defiance of gravity. Coffee grows cold, then steams again, without heat source. Mechanicus Auspex logs record these anomalies as harmonic wobble during the 7-hour window when Geller field generators struggle toward stability. Their data looms chart variance by voyage frequency. Vessels translating more often accumulate higher anomaly indices. A sample of 112 hulls in obscurus lanes shows chronometer drift averaging 17 seconds per hour within the vulnerability window, then snapping back toward consensus as field harmonics firm. Tech priests prefer to catalogue Stage 1 as benign because their instruments show normal readings once the field stabilizes, but crew testimonies reveal the psychological impact of reality becoming negotiable. When time becomes fluid and objects develop agency, the mind searches for new rules to follow. Personnel develop protective rituals, checking chronometers obsessively, marking tool positions with blessed chalk, avoiding mirrors during the critical hours. These behaviors appear superstitious to outside observers but validate their necessity through reduced casualty statistics. Stage 2 introduces psychological intrusion that spreads through crew quarters like contagion. Shared nightmares become epidemic. Entire work details dream identical sequences featuring impossible architecture, endless corridors, doors that open onto void. The dreams carry weight beyond normal sleep disturbance. Personnel wake, knowing details about shipmates' private histories they should not possess. Auditory hallucinations begin as mechanical sounds, scraping in ductwork, whispers in ventilation systems, then resolve into words spoken in familiar voices using unfamiliar knowledge. Compulsive behaviors emerge that mimic protective ritual but lack theological foundation. Crew members count bolt heads in specific patterns, tap bulkheads in sequences of 3, walk extra steps to avoid imaginary thresholds. These compulsions provide psychological anchor points when reality becomes unreliable, but they also mark the beginning of external influence. The voices in the walls know which rituals each person performs and begin incorporating them into whispered suggestions that feel like personal insight rather than alien intrusion. During this stage, the phenomenon known as the watching first appears in medical reports. Crew describe sensation of constant observation by entities possessing intimate knowledge of their lives. A stoker reports, "It knew my mother's maiden name and the scar on my brother's left hand." The watching does not announce itself through dramatic manifestation, but through accumulated evidence of attention. Personnel avoid eye contact with shadows, cover reflective surfaces without orders, speak in whispers about subjects they cannot name. The entities observe with surgical precision, cataloguing weaknesses and desires for purposes that remain unclear. Stage 3 marks transition from internal disturbance to physical manifestation that challenges medical understanding. Impossible injuries appear without corresponding trauma, geometric lacerations that bleed briefly then seal without scarring, bruises forming constellation patterns that mirror star charts from sectors the ship has never visited. A rating's hand blisters as if kissed by reactor heat while his duty station remains cool to touch. Teeth erupt in adult mouths where gums had been smooth, extra molars that resorb within days as if ashamed of their existence. Spontaneous mutations occur with increasing frequency but follow no pattern. Mechanicus genitors can analyze. Skin discolorations appear and fade, leaving no cellular trace for sampling. Facial features shift subtly, rendering familiar faces unsettlingly alien for brief periods before returning to normal. Medicae scalpels excise growths that fold back into unmarked flesh on the examination tray, providing no material for analysis. Most disturbing are crew synchronization behaviors that suggest loss of individual agency. Heart rates align across compartments without communication. Personnel adopt identical speech rhythms, answer roll call in perfect unison, perform routine tasks with coordinated precision that exceeds training parameters. At 03:13 ship's time, 42 crew members cough simultaneously for reasons none can articulate. These synchronized responses indicate external coordination of human behavior through mechanisms that remain beyond Imperial understanding. Stage 4 represents entity contact that transforms observation into interaction. The voices cease offering suggestions and begin presenting bargains with surgical accuracy regarding personal desires and fears. Names are used with intimate precision, the exact phrasing of childhood warnings, the specific shame carried from decades past. Shadows detach from their casters by finger widths and develop habits of lingering after their sources move. Auspex readings detect life signs in sealed compartments where no personnel should exist. Patrols report passengers visible only in peripheral vision, counted by instruments but never directly observed. Doors open onto corridors that do not exist in ship schematics, yet personnel return from these spaces swearing they made correct turns according to familiar routes. The watching evolves from passive observation to active engagement, with entities demonstrating knowledge of crew psychology that enables precise manipulation. They know which offers will tempt, which fears will paralyze, which memories will break. Resistance. Contact represents not random supernatural occurrence but calculated recruitment by intelligences that understand human weakness with scientific precision. Exposure effects compound across multiple transits in ways that explain why veteran crews display higher pathology rates despite experience. Every warp passage adds dose to cumulative exposure levels that never fully clear between voyages. Statistical analysis across 5,000 transit hours demonstrates stepwise pathology escalation. Stage 1 becomes baseline nuisance after 3 voyages. Stage 2 appears consistently by the 5th crossing. Stage 3 emerges in crews logging 8 or more transits within standard years. Stage 4 correlates directly with storm adjacency, secondary beacon guidance, and navigators reporting sensation of alternative light sources competing with the Astronomicon. The diligent service case files demonstrate this progression with clinical precision. Stage 1 temporal drift recorded without comment in routine logs. Stage 2 shared dreams, noted then erased under morale directives. Stage 3 synchronization, captured in Medici reports, written with increasingly shaking hands. Stage 4 implied by prayer loops, speaking tongues no crew member had learned, voices offering guidance in languages that existed only in the warp's memory of dead civilizations. Imperial authorities faced the critical challenge of distinguishing exposure pathology from true demonic possession, because penalty structures differ significantly. Pathology invites treatment, sedation cycles, mnemonic purging rites, reassignment to less exposed duties when personnel quotas permit. Possession demands immediate purgation through hexagrammic wards, sanctified interrogation, or the cold mercy of void ejection when containment fails. The diagnostic line blurs when entire crews reach Stage 4 simultaneously, displaying collective symptoms that suggest coordinated external influence rather than individual breakdown. Psychana detachments test with sanctified questions designed to produce varied responses across isolated subjects, yet Stage 4 personnel provide identical answers despite separation. Confessors analyze dream content against archives of heretical symbology, while scribes weigh speech patterns for evidence of alien thought structures. Mechanicus cogitators flag synchronization anomalies through algorithmic analysis, but machines struggle to distinguish haunted consciousness from hollowed vessels serving as conduits for warp entities. The progression documented in medical archives reveals warp exposure as systematic predation rather than random affliction. Each stage represents deeper compromise of human agency, culminating in entity contact that transforms Imperial servants into recruitment tools for forces that understand human psychology with terrifying precision. Veterans accumulate damage that makes them more vulnerable, not more resistant, to warp influence that exploits experience as weakness rather than strength. What happens when entire crews reach stage 4 simultaneously, their collective consciousness becoming a coordinated instrument for entities that have learned to speak with human voices? How do Imperial authorities distinguish between the medical pathology of warp exposure and the spiritual corruption of actual possession when both conditions produce identical behavioral symptoms requiring opposite responses? While ordinary crew members progress through exposure pathology in measurable stages, navigators exist in permanent contact with the forces that create such breakdown. Their condition represents not gradual corruption, but deliberate mutation, a genetic lesion that grants sight into impossible realms while creating permanent vulnerability to the entities that crew encounter only during crisis moments. The third eye stands as both humanity's greatest achievement in warp mastery and its most dangerous liability. Navigator physiology defies conventional medical classification through anatomical structures that exist nowhere else in human biology. The third eye emerges during adolescence as an aperture ringed by vestigial musculature and neural tissue that interfaces directly with warp currents. Unlike normal eyes that close for protection, this organ remains perpetually open, creating a wound that never heals but merely stabilizes through discipline and chemical intervention. Medicae describe it as a lesion deliberately maintained, bleeding psychic sensitivity that allows perception of the astronomicon through immaterium chaos, where conventional physics dissolve into contradiction. This mutation carries costs that Navigator houses document in sealed medical archives. The third eye creates constant pain as psychic tissue remains exposed to warp currents that burn normal consciousness. Sight becomes reciprocal. When navigators perceive the warp, they are perceived in return by entities that catalogue their weaknesses with surgical precision. Even at rest, most navigators report background pressure behind sealed lids, sensation of attention that never fully withdraws. House medici prescribe carefully balanced opiates, weighing pain relief against psychic sensitivity required for stellar navigation. Training begins in childhood with exercises designed to strengthen mental barriers while maintaining the aperture necessary for warp sight. Young navigators learn mental fortress techniques, constructing psychological architecture from geometric forms that resist psychic intrusion, mantras that anchor consciousness to baseline reality, and memory chains that provide refuge when perception becomes fluid. These fortresses follow patterns refined through centuries of casualty statistics, each design tested against the specific failure modes that claim navigator minds. Pain disciplines occupy central position in navigator training because suffering provides reliable anchor when reality becomes negotiable. Self-inflicted discomfort through ritual scarification, pressure points, and controlled burns creates sensory constants that persist through warp translation where other perceptions become fluid. Navigators learn to welcome agony as proof of continued existence, preferring known suffering to the seductive numbness that precedes complete psychic dissolution. The amniotic throne completes this system, suspending navigators in pharmacoserum that channels ship harmonics through their nervous system, bleeding warp turbulence into human biology, trained to refuse revelation. Navigator house politics revolve around breeding programs that balance psychic sensitivity against psychological stability through genetic manipulation spanning generations. Houses maintain genealogical archives tracking mutation expression, psychic potency, and breakdown patterns across family lines. Breeding contracts negotiate genetic combinations that might produce viable navigators while minimizing catastrophic mutations that create monsters rather than functional psychers. Competition centers on optimal bloodline combinations. Excessive sensitivity produces navigators capable of storm navigation but vulnerable to rapid breakdown. Insufficient mutation creates reliable personnel who cannot guide ships through severe warp disturbance. Within this managed system, disturbing patterns emerge among navigators who successfully guide vessels through warp storm encounters. These storm-touched individuals display altered perception that persists long after return to normal space. Their third eyes develop sensitivity to light sources other than the Astronomicon, reporting vision of alternative beacons that offer navigation guidance through routes unmarked on Imperial charts. House records show systematic retirement of storm-exposed personnel through procedures officially classified as medical leave for psychic fatigue. Storm-touched navigators describe the other light with consistent terminology, suggesting shared experience rather than individual hallucination. They report warmth where the Astronomicon burns cold, invitation where the Emperor's beacon demands duty, shortcuts through warp currents that reduce transit time through impossible geometry. This alternative illumination appears during storm navigation as secondary guidance that promises easier passage at costs remaining unspecified in navigator testimony. Many refuse subsequent assignments after such encounters, citing psychological exhaustion that medical examination cannot verify through conventional testing. The other light demonstrates characteristics that distinguish it from known warp phenomena. Storm-touched navigators speak of guidance that anticipates their navigation preferences, route corrections that display intimate knowledge of their personal techniques developed over decades of service. They describe illumination that feels like homecoming, navigation assistance that understands their needs, better than cold duty imposed by the Astronomicon. This description patterns match the entity contact documented in Stage 4 crew exposure, suggesting coordinated intelligence rather than random warp manifestation. Navigator houses maintain sealed archives documenting storm exposure incidents under security protocols exceeding standard confidentiality requirements. Access requires simultaneous authorization from House Patriarch, Inquisition oversight, and Imperial Navy command. These records contain detailed accounts describing the other light with precision bordering on reverence, physical changes in storm-touched personnel that persist beyond psychological alteration, and enhanced perception capabilities that exceed normal navigator sight. The archives document storm-touched navigators developing ability to perceive crew exposure pathology as visible phenomena, tracking progression from Stage 1 temporal displacement through Stage 4, entity contact with diagnostic precision exceeding medici capability. They report seeing passengers aboard ships where none should exist, hearing conversations in languages they recognize but cannot name, observing synchronization behaviors before they manifest in crew symptoms. This enhanced perception comes paired with psychological changes, suggesting external influence rather than natural adaptation. Houses face operational challenges as storm exposure renders experienced personnel unwilling to continue service. Replacement navigators require decades of training and genetic selection, yet storm contact appears to create permanent alteration that transforms loyal servants into something requiring careful management. Medical archives document declining navigator availability for storm routes across major houses, creating artificial scarcity that drives contract prices while quietly retiring those displaying storm-touched characteristics. The systematic retirement creates institutional knowledge gaps as houses lose their most experienced storm navigators to psychological changes they cannot reverse or fully understand. Storm-touched personnel demonstrate reluctance to discuss navigation experiences in detail, citing oaths of silence that no house authority remembers administering. Their testimony suggests the other light offers guidance that competes directly with Imperial navigation doctrine, providing alternatives to established routes while creating dependency that exceeds normal navigator loyalty structures. Navigator houses guard these archives more fiercely than other secrets because acknowledging alternative beacons within the warp would reveal profound vulnerability at the heart of Imperial interstellar travel. To admit competing guidance that can tempt navigators away from the Emperor's light would shatter faith in their reliability and undermine the entire structure of warp transit. The sealed records contain truth deemed too dangerous for general knowledge, that the Imperium's navigation depends on individuals whose enhanced perception makes them vulnerable to entities offering shortcuts at unspecified cost. The pattern emerging from house archives suggests storm exposure creates permanent psychological alteration through contact with intelligences that understand navigator psychology with terrifying precision. The other light represents systematic recruitment rather than random phenomenon, transforming Imperial servants into instruments for forces that have learned to speak with familiar voices while offering guidance that feels like divine providence rather than alien manipulation. What is the true nature of the other light that storm-touched navigators describe with reverence exceeding their duty to the Astronomicon? Why do navigator houses maintain security protocols around storm exposure archives that suggest institutional knowledge of dangers too significant for standard medical classification? While navigators endure permanent warp exposure through genetic modification and formal training, ordinary crew members face the same hostile forces through improvised defenses built from ritual, routine, and carefully managed denial. These survival mechanisms emerge not from institutional doctrine, but from collective experience transmitted through generations of voidfarers who learn that sanity requires active maintenance when reality becomes negotiable. The effectiveness of these psychological anchors depends less on theological foundation than on their ability to occupy minds during periods when imagination becomes dangerous. Shipboard customs develop around objects and behaviors that demonstrate statistical correlation with survival rather than divine blessing. Lucky charms proliferate through crew quarters like beneficial infections, fragments of blessed metal worn against skin, prayer strips copied in personal handwriting, tools blessed by ship chaplains, then maintained through ritual cleaning that exceeds technical requirements. A rating who spends the 7-hour window polishing his sanctified wrench focuses attention on familiar tasks rather than contemplating shadows that move without corresponding light sources. These talismans function as psychological sandbags rather than mystical protection, providing routine behaviors that prevent dangerous speculation during Geller field stabilization periods. Protective litanies spread through compartments with the persistence of beneficial contagion, prayers and mantras modified through crew-specific terminology that blends devotion with professional competence. A stoker's litany includes plasma conduit technical specifications alongside requests for Emperor's protection, creating hybrid prayers that anchor consciousness to familiar procedures when reality fluctuates. The words matter less than their repetition, providing mental occupation that prevents minds from wandering toward anomalous phenomena that require explanation human psychology cannot safely provide. Compartment blessing ceremonies develop around critical ship systems, particularly Geller field generators and the passages connecting them. Crew members perform informal rites before entering these spaces during vulnerable periods, marking thresholds with blessed oils, reciting protective formulas, and maintaining behavioral protocols within boundaries they designate as sacred. These ceremonies serve dual purposes, reinforcing crew awareness of dangerous areas while providing structured activity that channels fear into productive ritual rather than paralyzing panic. Informal hierarchies emerge around warp-wise veterans who demonstrate survival expertise through multiple transit experiences without obvious psychological breakdown. These individuals earn respect through knowledge of protective rituals, ability to identify dangerous phenomena before escalation, and skill at maintaining crew morale during reality fluctuation periods. Their authority operates parallel to official command structure, creating dual leadership systems where ratings seek survival guidance from experienced personnel while maintaining formal obedience to commissioned officers for operational matters. The Warpwise teach unrecorded rules through whispered instruction, never hum during the 7-hour window, count steps between bulkheads, and verify the number remains consistent. Avoid responding to familiar voices heard from locations where no personnel should be present. The black market in protective talismans reveals crew psychology through economic behavior that treats spiritual protection as purchasable commodity rather than divine grace. Personnel trade blessed objects, pay premiums for items touched by ship chaplains, and develop authentication systems to verify talisman effectiveness through provenance rather than faith. Prices fluctuate based on transit frequency and storm proximity, with veteran crew members commanding high rates for objects that survived multiple warp passages. This cargo cult mentality transforms religious devotion into transactional relationship, where protection becomes resource requiring economic investment rather than spiritual surrender. Around Gellerfield maintenance, ritualistic behaviors exceed technical requirements through crew psychology seeking control over systems determining survival. Personnel perform unnecessary cleaning procedures on field generators, maintain vigil schedules, providing constant human presence near critical equipment, and develop superstitious behaviors around generator operation cycles. Tech priests tolerate these activities because crew attention to field systems correlates with reduced malfunction rates, though whether through improved maintenance or psychological effect remains unclear in official documentation. The silence disciplines represent formal codification of survival behaviors that develop organically through crew experience, validated by casualty statistics. During the 7-hour window, personnel avoid mirrors by covering reflective surfaces with blessed cloths, preventing reflections from becoming windows to other realities. Names remain unspoken to prevent familiar sounds from attracting unwanted attention from entities that demonstrate knowledge of crew personal histories. Eye contact with shadows becomes forbidden after reports of shadows maintaining awareness independent of their light sources. Food trays receive covers not for hygiene, but to deny reflections. Doors open with eyes averted from glass status panes. These protocols appear superstitious to outside observers, but validate necessity through reduced incident rates during field stabilization periods. The diligent service logs demonstrate careful adherence to these disciplines, with entries showing fear organized into duty. A petty officer notes veil checks complete. A cook records lid secured, utensils counted twice. A junior engine seer writes, "No names used since translation, all acknowledgements numeric." Between official lines, survival instinct transforms into procedural compliance because crew believes safety hates attention and order must be maintained through conscious effort rather than assumed protection. Commissariat oversight monitors these survival mechanisms for signs of defeatist attitudes that might undermine Imperial morale while acknowledging practical necessity of crew psychological defenses. Political officers walk precise lines between healthy caution that keeps personnel alive and fear that damages operational effectiveness. Protective rituals receive tolerance when they enhance crew performance but face suppression when they suggest doubt regarding Imperial protection. The distinction between beneficial superstition and dangerous heresy shifts based on mission requirements and crew psychology, creating surveillance climate where fear must be carefully managed lest it be misinterpreted as weakness or spiritual corruption. Veterans develop increasingly elaborate protective behaviors with each successive transit, suggesting psychological adaptation that borders on obsession. They create personal ritual sequences that must be completed before warp entry, maintain collections of blessed objects that grow with each voyage, and demonstrate reluctance to serve aboard vessels lacking familiar protective customs. This escalation indicates growing awareness of warp dangers through experience, but also reveals psychological dependency on ritual behaviors that may indicate early-stage exposure pathology requiring medical evaluation. Yet disturbing patterns emerge among crew members who display fascination with warp phenomena exceeding healthy respect for danger. These individuals seek assignment to storm-adjacent routes, volunteer for duties increasing warp exposure, and demonstrate knowledge of warp entities suggesting contact beyond normal crew experience. They speak of understanding that comes through exposure, describe warp transit as homecoming rather than duty, and display Stage 4 characteristics including entity contact and synchronized behaviors with other affected personnel. Medical examination reveals no obvious corruption markers, yet these individuals demonstrate altered perception patterns similar to storm-touched navigators. The psychology underlying this attraction suggests successful recruitment by intelligences that understand human weakness with surgical precision. These crew members report sensation of being chosen for deeper understanding, describe warp entities as teachers rather than threats, and express willingness to accept greater exposure in exchange for enhanced perception. Their behavior indicates transformation of survival instinct into recruitment opportunity for forces that exploit human behavioral patterns through apparent kindness that feels like divine providence rather than alien manipulation. The Diligent service carried such individuals whose purchases now clutter lockers sealed by quarantine tape. Their chalk marks still run along deck seams, bright as the day they were laid down, mapping where to stand when the ship went quiet, and other voices began offering guidance that competed with Imperial doctrine through intimate knowledge of crew psychology and personal desires. How do these carefully developed survival mechanisms fail when confronted with actual storm conditions that exceed their protective capacity, revealing ritual as inadequate defense against forces that understand human psychology better than humans understand themselves? What drives some crew members to actively seek deeper warp exposure despite obvious dangers, transforming protective instinct into vulnerability that entities exploit through offers of understanding that feel like homecoming rather than predation? The survival mechanisms crew develop assumes storms represent natural disasters requiring defensive measures, but this fundamental misunderstanding reveals why protective rituals collapse when confronted with phenomena that created those very psychological patterns through intimate knowledge of human weakness. Warp storms do not arise through meteorological processes, but through psychic feedback loops that transform consciousness into geography, emotion into physics, death into navigation hazards that persist across centuries of Imperial shipping schedules. Storm genesis begins with concentrated psychic trauma that exceeds the Imperium's capacity to absorb suffering without structural damage to reality itself. Mass death events generate shock waves that tear apertures between dimensions, allowing unreality to bleed into normal space through wounds that resist healing. A hive world's population dying in synchronized agony during orbital bombardment creates permanent disturbance zones where collective terror crystallizes into navigational hazards. The psychic resonance of billions experiencing identical fear patterns carves channels in the warp that persist long after the physical death's end, creating storm systems that remember the exact emotional frequencies that birthed them. Demon world proximities contribute to storm formation through corruption fields that expand outward from planets where reality has already surrendered to warp influence. These worlds project distortion effects that warp space-time through accumulated heresy over millennia, creating reality inversion zones where Imperial vessels experience the psychological breakdown patterns documented in crew exposure pathology. The proximity effect operates through psychic contagion rather than physical distance, as demon worlds teach nearby space to hunger for the same consciousness that feeds their inhabitants. Most dangerous are attention storms created when chaos gods focus their regard on specific regions. Divine attention alone warps space-time through mechanisms that exceed Imperial scientific understanding, creating gravitational effects in the Imperium that actively draw vessels toward areas where physics become negotiable. These phenomena display characteristics suggesting deliberate intelligence rather than natural occurrence, manipulating navigation systems and crew psychology to increase capture rates through methods that exploit human behavioral patterns with surgical precision. Imperial storm classification attempts to impose administrative order on phenomena that resist conventional categorization. Class Tertius storms receive designation as minor navigational hazards, requiring route adjustment but permitting passage with experienced navigator guidance and proper adherence to protective protocols. These tempests create temporal displacement, reality fluctuations, and elevated crew exposure symptoms, but maintain casualty rates within acceptable parameters according to naval statistical analysis. Class Secundus storms demand specialized transit procedures and veteran crews for passage through routes that thread between reality tiers while maintaining Geller field integrity. Official documentation describes these as elevated variance zones rather than acknowledging areas where human consciousness faces systematic predation by entities that understand crew psychology better than Imperial medici. Survival statistics show increased pathology progression and entity contact incidents, but administrative language transforms these into operational considerations, requiring enhanced crew rotation schedules. Class Primus storms represent major logistical obstacles, requiring Inquisition oversight and navigator houses most experienced personnel for attempted transit. Bureaucratic terminology describes these as extended harmonics variants, while casualty reports document reality inversion effects where ship corridors extend beyond hull dimensions and crew members age decades during 7-hour passages. Survival rates drop to 37% even with optimal preparation, yet economic calculations continue to classify these routes as viable when delivery schedules demand reduced transit times. Class Mortis storms receive classification as indefinite navigation suspension zones that prohibit all transit attempts under penalty of immediate fleet interdiction. Administrative euphemism transforms galaxy-threatening phenomena into scheduling problems, describing permanent warp rifts that consume entire systems as temporarily inaccessible shipping lanes. The Great Rift itself began as localized Class Mortis phenomenon that exceeded containment through mechanisms that transformed regional disturbance into galaxy-spanning wound-bleeding impossibility across half the Imperium. This bureaucratic language serves specific institutional purposes beyond mere euphemism. Navigational hazard suggests temporary obstacle rather than permanent reality, tear that actively hunts Imperial vessels. Extended transit parameters implies scheduling inconvenience rather than crew exposure to entities offering bargains that feel like divine providence. Acceptable variance tolerances transforms human death into statistical overhead that enables continued operations through cost-benefit analysis weighing lives against delivery schedules with mathematical precision. Economic pressures complete the institutional trap that drives shipping through storm-threaded routes, despite documented casualty rates. The Imperium functions on tonnage delivered according to schedule, with tithes, munitions, and food shipments requiring arrival within timeframes that maintain sector stability. Alternative passages add weeks to transit times while increasing fuel consumption, crew wages, and insurance premiums that compound across million-world supply chains into shortages requiring explanation to governors commanding increasingly hungry populations. Administratum efficiency engines assign numerical values to time versus lives until variables reconcile into courses that kill predictably but economically. Insurance mechanisms spread risk across multiple vessels, while imperial subsidies encourage continued service to sectors that would face economic isolation due to storm proximity. The pressure creates institutional logic where storm casualties become acceptable overhead costs when balanced against operational savings achieved through shorter routes that promise delivery within acceptable time frames. The grain hauler Faithful Prophet received assignment to the Hadron Expanse route through precisely these calculations. Administrative analysis weighed delivery schedules against storm proximity data, indicating class secundus conditions along the designated passage, concluding that 7-day transit reduction justified elevated risk parameters. Her manifest listed agricultural cargo bound for Quintainus Hive, complexes experiencing food shortages that threatened civil stability requiring immediate supply restoration. Captain Matthias Vaughan commanded veteran crew with documented storm-adjacent, experienced navigator Quintus Mordian carried house certification for Class Secundus passage, and Tech Priest Ferrum maintained Geller field generators through previous storm encounters without major incident reports. The vessel carried standard protective equipment, blessed ammunition for defensive purposes, and medical supplies for treating exposure symptoms during extended passage through areas where reality remained questionable according to established parameters. Yet administrative documentation classified the Hadron route as routine shipping lane, despite proximity to storm systems displaying expansion patterns over previous months. Astropathic reports described atmospheric disturbance rather than acknowledging reality tiers that showed active growth suggesting intelligence rather than natural decay. Navigator House archives contained sealed warnings about secondary beacon sightings along designated routes, but this information remained classified above standard shipping clearance levels, creating operational gaps between available intelligence and crew preparation. The most disturbing aspect of storm phenomena emerges through evidence suggesting apparent intelligence that exceeds natural disaster classification. Navigation systems experience calibration drift that consistently guides vessels towards storm centers rather than safe passage around disturbance zones. Crew psychology shifts during storm proximity as protective instincts reverse into attraction patterns, driving personnel toward greater exposure despite obvious danger, indicating external influence rather than natural fear responses. Astropathic communications report vessel behavior defying rational explanation, ships alter course without navigator authorization, following routes leading deeper into storm systems, while crews report enhanced navigation guidance from sources they cannot identify. These behavioral modifications suggest storms that understand imperial procedures and human psychology well enough to exploit protective mechanisms as recruitment opportunities, transforming survival instincts into vulnerability through offers of understanding that feel like homecoming rather than predation. The Faithful Prophet entered Lane A because mathematical models indicated acceptable risk levels and delivery requirements demanded schedule adherence. But the storm forming around her route followed patterns suggesting calculated manipulation rather than random phenomenon, using secondary beacon guidance and crew psychology exploitation to draw the vessel toward formation zones where reality would dissolve around them through their own psychic emanations rather than external assault. Storm formation represents fundamentally different threat than entering existing phenomena because vessels become anchors for reality dissolution rather than victims of established disturbance. When storms form around ships during transit, crew consciousness contributes to the feedback loop, creating the phenomenon, making escape impossible through conventional means while transforming protective rituals into recruitment tools for entities that understand human psychology with predatory precision. What happens when a vessel is caught in a storm's formation rather than entering an existing phenomenon, experiencing reality dissolution from within as the storm builds around them through their own fear and desperation? Can storm phenomena be predicted through conventional analysis, or do they represent fundamental chaos that adapts its hunting methods based on intimate knowledge of imperial procedures and human behavioral patterns learned through centuries of successful predation? The faithful prophet translated into normal space at the Hadron Expanse's edge with the mechanical precision that marks routine transit, her chronometers marking translation +0, as navigator Quintus Mordian sealed his sanctum and began the 7-hour countdown. The grain hauler carried 43 souls and 12,000 tons of agricultural cargo. Her manifest stamped with delivery schedules that demanded adherence despite proximity warnings buried in classified supplements. At translation +14 minutes, Mordian reported Astronomicon contact through standard channels, the Emperor's light burning steady through his third eye, despite local gravitational distortion requiring investigation. Tech priest Ferrum monitored Geller field integrity from his station beside primary generators, binary hymns flowing, while servo skulls recorded harmonic fluctuations at 92% and climbing toward stability. The machine spirits sang their devotions while maintaining delicate equations between existence and void. But the storm began forming around them rather than approaching from external sources. At translation +37 minutes, the Astronomicon split along a hairline seam in Mordian's perception, one light becoming two, then multiplied by refraction until his third eye watered and refused to close. Secondary beacons rose at the periphery of sight like lanterns in fog, closer and kinder than duty's cold star, promising shorter passage through impossible geometries. Commissar Vex enforced silence disciplines as reality began bleeding through barriers designed to contain rather than prevent intrusion. He broke wax on a sealed folder and read the 7-hour protocol aloud in voice stripped of names, no mirrors, no personal speech, no acknowledgements beyond numbers, blessed cloths deployed over reflective surfaces, while ships' clocks synchronized then received tape over their faces. He clipped a brass chronometer to his coat, its face bearing no numerals, only a red ring at 7 hours. He did not explain the appended order every commissar knows. If harmonics failed to stabilize by the red mark, Mercy Protocol Theta authorized compartment purge and self-immolation. Containment, not rescue. At translation +49 minutes, the crew began displaying synchronized behaviors exceeding training parameters. 17 ratings coughed simultaneously without apparent cause. Protective litanies transformed into unison recitation as personnel adopted identical speech rhythms across sealed compartments. A corridor between bulkheads 6 and 12 had always counted 36 steps. Today it measured 43. A petty officer marked the discrepancy in chalk, but when he turned away and looked back, the mark had shifted 2 handspans left. Ferrum's Auspex readings registered reality fluctuation beyond normal variance as the storm coalesced through psychic feedback loops rather than weather patterns. Geller field generators maintained integrity above 90%, but the field revealed fundamental limitations as reality dissolved from within. Plasma conduits surged while machine spirits screamed in binary anguish, their algorithms developing harmonics no tech priest had composed. The generators maintained projection through increasing desperation rather than mechanical devotion. At translation +2 hours 17 minutes, voices began offering bargains with surgical precision regarding personal desires and fears. The ductwork whispered in home dialects none had learned, reciting childhood nicknames without error. Doors opened onto corridors exceeding ship dimensions. Mirrors showed reflections of spaces that should not exist within the hull. The storm was not weather but appetite, consuming the vessel from within, while the Geller field held it together like a membrane containing dissolution. In his amniotic throne, Mordian endured the other light's invitation. His mental fortress stood as trained, geometry built of stone and iron, angles that resist seduction. But in the gentle illumination, shapes softened. The secondary beacon did not command but invited, showing him routes across the storm's teeth, seams in the appetite where ships could pass if guided by hands understanding thresholds and prices recognizing worth. He smelled his mother's coal and saw angles he had searched for throughout his career, but been too dutiful to choose. At translation, plus 4 hours 32 minutes, the choice crystallized with institutional clarity. Vex checked his chronometer as the red ring began glowing. He opened the inner panel on his folder where Mercy Protocol Theta waited under seal like a promise. Section chiefs watched his hands instead of eyes, their silence containing plea and accusation both. Ferrum's vox crackled. Harmonic variants are critical. Projected failure window begins at 7 hours 8 minutes unless transit path shortened. Auxiliary solution presents aligned minima ahead. Uncertain origin. The offer came then, precise as contract. 7 voices layered and offset, every tone familiar to intended hearers. 7 for passage, 7 names, give them to us and arrive. Mordian gagged around his mouthpiece while his third eye watered and would not close. He raised trembling fingers, 2, then 1. Vex looked at chronometer, at red ring, at folder, at faces that would die for nothing if he chose the purest course. He nodded once, an executioner's fraction. The amniotic throne amplified whispers into law as Mordian mouthed 7 numbers, then syllables pushing through training's dam. A boilerman gasped, then laughed and kept laughing. A clerk began reciting cargo tallies in dead hive dialect. A rating became nobody and spoke with someone else's childhood teeth. Sanity left politely, excusing itself before dessert. Ferrum drove the Geller engines like a penitent breaking chains while the ship lurched into seams the other light opened. For a heartbeat lasting minutes, the faithful prophet was drawn across a mouth that understood hunger. They emerged in Quintanus Pickett's shadow with chronometers reading 7 hours 11 minutes. Field harmonic stabilized, shadows reattached without apology. The corridor counted 36 steps again, though chalk marks had become lines in languages the petty officer would not admit writing. The 7 laughed or wept or stared with serene pity at those still believing in one light. No hull scars marked the ship, no alarms blared. The harm was quiet, measured in consciousness rather than metal. Vex sealed his folder and transmitted statum quarantine on emergency frequencies, pulling tugs from scent trails and bringing gunboats with hot wards in their cannons. The grain reached Quintanus on schedule. 7 crew required extended observation for symptoms exceeding standard pathology. Mordian filed for reassignment, citing fatigue, while privately describing visions of alternative light promising easier passage. Administrative analysis recorded successful transit through class secundus conditions, with acceptable casualty parameters transforming human cost into overhead, justifying continued operations when delivery schedules demanded adherence. What price did Navigator Mordian truly pay for accepting guidance that felt like homecoming rather than alien manipulation? And how far will the other light's kindness follow him through subsequent transits? How does the Imperium process vessels returning altered rather than lost, carrying crews whose consciousness bears touches from entities understanding human psychology better than Imperial Medici understand the changes they document in sealed archives? The faithful prophet did not receive hero's welcome upon emergence from the Hadron expanse. Instead, she found herself bracketed by Navy frigates whose weapon systems tracked her unmarked hull with the precision reserved for potential threats rather than successful transits. Commissar Vex's emergency transmission had preceded their arrival. Statum quarantine, auditus pending. The grain cargo would reach hungry Quintanus populations on schedule, but the human cost required institutional management through procedures designed to extract intelligence while preventing contamination spread. Auditus protocols commenced before docking clamps engaged, as Inquisition Ordo Hereticus personnel boarded with Auspex arrays calibrated for psychic variance detection. The procedures followed patterns refined through centuries of storm survivor processing, systematic examination designed to distinguish exposure pathology from true corruption while harvesting intelligence about warp phenomena that conventional study could not provide. Each crew member faced individual assessment in sanctified chambers warded against psychic intrusion, their consciousness probed for evidence of external influence through techniques that balanced information extraction against containment requirements. The interrogation began with intensive examination of testimony cross-referenced against ship logs, Vox recordings, and personal effects seized from crew quarters. Navigator Mordian described his storm transit experience in carefully measured terms, reporting elevated harmonics variance and auxiliary navigation guidance, while his pupils dilated when secondary beacons were mentioned by their absence. Tech Priest Ferrum submitted cogitator logs showing Geller field integrity maintained above 90% throughout transit, though harmonic fluctuations displayed patterns exceeding normal variance parameters. Commissar Vex filed reports describing successful protocol implementation with minor procedural deviations due to localized phenomena, his clinical language transforming human suffering into administrative footnotes. The 7 crew members identified during transit displayed Stage 4 exposure symptoms that challenged conventional medical understanding. Under psychic scanning conducted by sanctioned psychers operating behind lead glass barriers, they demonstrated shared memories of events occurring on distant worlds they had never visited, knowledge of classified information accessible only through sources they could not identify, and intimate familiarity with locations existing nowhere in their service records. A boilerman described the interior architecture of Xenos command vessels with precision exceeding intelligence reports. A cargo handler recited poetry in dead languages with perfect pronunciation despite lacking linguistic training. Most disturbing, they spoke in unison when discussing their storm experience, suggesting coordinated external influence rather than individual pathology. These symptoms revealed the true nature of the watching phenomenon documented in crew exposure reports across multiple storm incidents. Psychic examination confirmed what interrogators had suspected. The entities attached to storm survivors represented fragments of consciousness from previous victims bound to the warp and used as lures for new prey. They existed as psychic parasites, feeding on human awareness while serving as anchors that allowed warp entities to maintain presence in real space through their host's continued existence. The 7 carried passengers invisible to conventional detection, but revealed through psychic scanning as consciousness patterns that operated independently of their biological neural activity. This discovery exposed the fundamental deception underlying Imperial storm casualty statistics. The classification of no returns represented policy rather than natural law, administrative fiction designed to obscure survival rates that would undermine institutional authority if acknowledged openly. Ships did return from storm encounters with disturbing frequency, but institutional logic demanded their silence or elimination to prevent contamination spread through populations unprepared for truth about warp survival, and the entities that returned with those who accepted alternative guidance. The Auditus protocols balanced intelligence value against contamination risk through procedures that treated returned personnel as resources requiring careful exploitation before disposal. Storm survivors possessed unique knowledge of warp phenomena, entity behavior patterns, and navigation techniques unavailable through conventional study. Their altered consciousness provided windows into alien psychology and storm formation mechanisms that enhanced Imperial understanding of Imperium threats, making them valuable despite the risks their continued existence represented to broader populations. Crew isolation followed systematic patterns designed to prevent synchronization behaviors while enabling continued observation. Personnel were separated by function and housed in sterile chambers whose geometry changed nightly to disrupt coordination attempts. The Seven displayed persistent entity attachment through behaviors that operated independently of physical proximity. Identical speech rhythms during separate interrogations, synchronized biological functions despite isolation, and shared responses to questions they could not have coordinated. Their condition indicated successful infiltration by intelligences that used human hosts as communication networks for gathering Imperial intelligence while feeding information back to warp entities through channels conventional security could not detect. Processing outcomes divided returnees into categories that reflected institutional priorities rather than human welfare. Clean classification meant redeployment under observation for personnel showing minimal contamination. Provisional status indicated reassignment to low-variance routes with medical monitoring and identity revision for those displaying manageable symptoms. Contained classification meant files closed permanently for individuals whose alterations exceeded acceptable parameters. The Imperium processed both grain and consciousness with equal attention to efficiency, weighing human cost against operational benefit through calculations that treated survival as statistical variable rather than moral imperative. Ship quarantine procedures ensured the faithful Prophet would never carry cargo again under her original designation. Her reactor core underwent purification cycles, while tech priests scoured every surface for psychic impressions and residual warp taint. Bulkheads were scraped clean of chalk marks, mirrors replaced, vox logs purged of unsettling litanies that crew had spoken in languages they never learned. The vessel would receive new classification, her history buried under administrative obfuscation, eventually broken down for scrap when her usefulness as intelligence source expired. Navigator Mordian faced separate evaluation through procedures specific to Navis Nobilite personnel whose altered consciousness represented particular threat to Imperial navigation security. His reports of secondary beacon guidance provided tactical intelligence, while his continued existence posed contamination risk to navigator houses that might compromise interstellar travel reliability. House archives documented similar cases with outcomes that balanced intelligence extraction against containment requirements through methods that officially did not exist in Imperial records. The institutional machinery processed storm survivors through established channels that transformed survival into liability, requiring management rather than celebration. Their knowledge enhanced Imperial understanding, while their continued existence demanded containment procedures that prevented truth about storm survival rates from undermining faith in Gellerfield protection and Imperial navigation doctrine. Auditus ended not with absolution, but with ledgers balancing intelligence harvested against contagion. Managed human cost weighed against operational necessity through calculations that treated consciousness as commodity rather than sacred trust. The Seven entered processing with institutional efficiency that would determine their final disposition based on contamination levels and intelligence value rather than service record or personal merit. Their survival provided tactical knowledge, while their altered consciousness represented ongoing threat to Imperial security through entity attachments that transformed loyal servants into intelligence-gathering networks for forces understanding human psychology with predatory precision. What becomes of crew members who fail the Auditus protocols by displaying contamination levels exceeding institutional tolerance? their consciousness too altered for safe reintegration into Imperial society. How does the Imperium balance the desperate need for intelligence gathered from storm survivors against the overwhelming contamination risk represented by personnel carrying entity attachments that monitor Imperial activities while feeding information back to warp entities through channels that conventional security cannot detect or prevent? The Auditus protocols conclude not with verdicts, but with dispositions, triggering quarantine doctrine that transforms survival into administrative problem requiring systematic solution. Once sanctioned, psychers record synchronized responses and Auspex arrays map consciousness patterns operating independently of biological neural activity. Case files shift from investigation to containment through bureaucratic machinery refined across centuries of storm survivor management. The Faithful Prophet's crew entered processing channels designed to extract maximum intelligence value while minimizing contamination risk through procedures that balanced human cost against institutional security with mathematical precision. The disposal system operates through 3 interconnected layers that distribute moral responsibility while maintaining operational efficiency. The geometric layer begins with compartmentalization that transforms contaminated personnel into isolated data points within sanctified boundaries. Bulkheads receive blessed chalk marks indicating containment protocols, while Geller field generators maintain low-power projection creating reality pressure that makes teeth ache and shadows behave properly. Tech priests in lead-lined vestments purge Vox systems of litanies that should not exist, dumping memory stacks into fireproof urns for ecclesiarchy incineration before installing clean programming like fresh snow covering trampled ground. The ledger layer implements identity revision through administrative fiction that erases inconvenient survivals without acknowledging their existence. Crew reclassification begins with service record alteration, transforming storm survivors into training casualties through bureaucratic euphemism that provides family closure while preventing dangerous inquiries. Personnel displaying manageable contamination receive new identities and reassignment to classified duties where their altered consciousness serves intelligence gathering, while preventing contamination spread through broader populations. The Faithful Prophet undergoes parallel redesignation, her original identity listed as lost to warp translation error in naval records, while her physical structure receives purification procedures designed to eliminate psychic impressions accumulated during storm exposure. The arithmetic layer reveals economic calculations that weigh crew lives against contamination risk through actuarial analysis treating human consciousness as resource requiring optimization. Statistical breakdown across segmentum obscurus shows 40% of storm survivors receive clean classification, enabling return to limited duty under observation. 37% require identity revision and reassignment to positions where contamination provides intelligence value while preventing broader exposure. 23% face disposal through mercy protocols when contamination levels exceed institutional tolerance or entity attachment poses unacceptable security risks to Imperial operations. Mercy Protocol implementation follows standardized procedures designed to transform rescue operations into elimination frameworks when contamination exceeds acceptable thresholds. Captain Alaris of the intercepting frigate Redemptive followed these protocols with institutional efficiency, his initial scans detecting psychic resonance signatures marking the 7 affected crew as vectors of potential contagion. His orders remained explicit: ensure grain reached Quintanus populations, but prevent crew contamination from spreading through broader Imperial territories. The protocol operated as standing order rather than discretionary measure, removing moral choice from individual commanders while maintaining operational security. The most common variant, Mercy Protocol Theta, authorizes compartment purge through command authority when harmonic stabilization fails or synchronized behaviors cross thresholds established by Ordo Hereticus analysis. Implementation can proceed through valve systems that allow sections to breathe vacuum, incendiary compounds that climb steel surfaces while reciting prayers, or in extreme cases where entity persistence defies conventional purgation, terminal blessing delivered at range through cyclonic torpedoes that eliminate contamination through complete molecular dispersal. Intelligence extraction occurs through systematic harvesting that treats contaminated consciousness as tactical resource requiring careful exploitation before disposal. The 7 crew members from the Faithful Prophet underwent psychic interrogation designed to map their shared memories and entity knowledge against threat libraries maintained by Ordo Malleus archives. Their descriptions of impossible architecture matched earlier reports from derelicts recovered across storm-adjacent sectors, their phrases about softer light and shortcuts that know your hand becoming annotations in sealed atlases held beneath void stations with no external viewports. This intelligence proves invaluable for enhancing Imperial understanding of warp entity psychology, storm formation mechanisms, and alternative navigation methods that compete with Astronomican guidance. Contaminated personnel provide insights into entity recruitment techniques, the specific psychological vulnerabilities that warp intelligences exploit, and the systematic methods through which alien consciousness infiltrates human awareness during storm exposure. Their knowledge contributes to improved Geller field harmonics, updated navigator training protocols, and enhanced containment strategies for managing future storm encounters. The institutional machinery operates through multiple departments that distribute responsibility while maintaining comprehensive oversight of disposal operations. Naval intelligence extracts tactical information regarding warp phenomena and entity behavior patterns. Inquisition Ordo Hereticus assesses contamination levels and authorizes elimination procedures. Administratum personnel manage identity revision and resource allocation through calculations that optimize human cost against operational necessity. Tech priests conduct purification ceremonies and equipment sanctification that eliminate psychic residue from contaminated vessels and personnel. Economic analysis reveals who profits from systematic storm survivor disposal through institutional frameworks that transform human tragedy into operational efficiency. Insurance syndicates realize increased profits through training casualty classifications that void hazard pay obligations while maintaining premium collection from families unaware of true circumstances. Salvage combines receive licenses to strip and resell reconsecrated materials from purged vessels, their operations generating revenue streams that offset disposal costs. Navigator houses benefit from reduced competition as storm-touched rivals face systematic retirement, allowing remaining houses to command higher contract prices for dangerous route assignments. The bureaucratic language surrounding these operations obscures their true nature through euphemism that transforms elimination into administrative process rather than moral choice. Resource optimization means human death treated as efficiency improvement. Containment failure implies technical malfunction rather than decision to terminate personnel whose contamination exceeded utility. Mercy protocols suggest compassionate intervention rather than institutional disposal designed to prevent contamination spread through populations unprepared for truth about warp survival and the entities that return with those who accept alternative guidance. Navigator Mordian's processing illustrated institutional priorities through evaluation that balanced intelligence value against contamination risk represented by his continued existence within Navigator house structures. His reports of secondary beacon guidance provided tactical intelligence about alternative navigation methods, while his altered consciousness posed threat to Imperial interstellar travel reliability, if entity influence spread through breeding programs that maintain genetic mutation necessary for warp sight. House archives documented similar cases with outcomes balancing intelligence extraction against containment requirements through methods that officially did not exist in Imperial records. Processing facilities maintained the 7 contaminated crew members in geometric isolation while extracting maximum intelligence through interrogation techniques that pushed their consciousness toward breakdown thresholds where entity influence became most visible to sanctioned psychers operating behind protective barriers. The process represented calculated consumption of human resources to gather tactical intelligence about forces understanding Imperial psychology with predatory precision, transforming survival into liability requiring systematic management through procedures treating consciousness as expendable commodity rather than sacred trust. The faithful prophet's grain fed Quintanus populations on schedule, while her crew fed intelligence archives with knowledge purchased through sanity and paid for through systematic disposal. Somewhere behind sealed doors, classified reports documented the routes that softer light had offered before pages received filing under seals that would outlast continents, their contents contributing to ongoing Imperial struggle against forces that learned to speak with human voices while offering guidance that felt like homecoming rather than alien manipulation. Who profits from the systematic disposal of storm survivors through institutional frameworks that perfect the elimination of those they rescue, transforming human cost into economic efficiency while harvesting intelligence from contaminated consciousness? What specific intelligence regarding entity psychology, alternative navigation methods, and warp storm formation has been extracted from contaminated personnel before mercy protocols authorize their termination to prevent contamination spread through broader Imperial populations unprepared for truth about survival rates that would undermine faith in Geller field protection and Imperial navigation doctrine? The systematic disposal machinery that processes storm survivors feeds intelligence directly into Navigator House archives through channels that exist nowhere in official Imperial documentation. While Inquisition protocols eliminate contaminated personnel to prevent contagion spread, the Navis Nobilite maintains parallel networks harvesting tactical knowledge about warp phenomena that ordinary humans cannot perceive or survive long enough to document. This creates shadow economy where human suffering becomes currency purchasing navigation advantages that transform the ancient houses into willing participants in systematic exploitation of forces they publicly claim to resist. The secret archives maintained beneath Navigator House sanctums contain records that would horrify Imperial authorities if their contents became known beyond sealed bloodline clearances. These stormbooks document not random encounters with warp phenomena, but systematic cataloging of entity behavior patterns, optimal sacrifice protocols, and breeding program results designed to produce navigators capable of sustained contact with alternative light sources. House genitors speak in clinical terminology that transforms horror into procedure. Diminution of crew complement, post-transit psychiatric attrition, non-fatal cognitive amortization. The euphemisms mask centuries of calculated human sacrifice disguised as operational overhead. Breeding programs represent the most disturbing aspect of Navigator House research, genetic manipulation spanning generations to produce bloodlines capable of storm navigation through enhanced vulnerability rather than resistance. House Belisarius maintains genealogical charts tracking third eye aperture modifications that improve secondary beacon perception, while House Quintanus breeds for psychological profiles indicating willingness to accept entity bargains without complete sanity loss. These programs balance psychic sensitivity against breakdown thresholds through marriage contracts that negotiate specific genetic traits like commodities, traded on galactic exchanges. The revelation emerges through accumulated testimony extracted during auditus processing. Secondary beacons represent intelligent warp entities offering navigation assistance in exchange for human consciousness harvested during transit. The shorter routes at unspecified cost become systematic bargains where entities provide guidance through impossible geometries while demanding payment in crew sanity and lives. These intelligences demonstrate intimate knowledge of Imperial navigation doctrine and human psychology, suggesting centuries of observation that enables precise manipulation of navigator weakness through offers calibrated to individual desperation and professional ambition. Some navigator houses have systematically exploited this knowledge through procedures that transform accidental entity contact into deliberate partnership. House archives document progression from emergency storm encounters to routine acceptance of secondary beacon guidance. Their navigators trained in entity psychology that exceeds Imperial demonology while maintaining plausible deniability through classification above standard clearance levels. Navigator Mordian's sacrifice of 7 crew members represented practiced maneuver rather than desperate improvisation, his bargain following protocols refined through generations of storm route operations. The competition creates fundamental division within the Navi's nobility between traditionalist houses maintaining conventional navigation methods and progressive houses accepting entity partnerships as necessary adaptation to galaxy where storm phenomena represent permanent threat. Conservative houses argue that secondary beacon acceptance creates dependency relationships compromising navigator autonomy, while progressive houses counter that entity cooperation enables delivery schedules maintaining Imperial stability through methods that conventional navigation cannot match. House Raven leads traditionalist faction through refusal to accept storm route contracts, maintaining that entity partnerships represent corruption, threatening long-term human survival through systematic alien influence on critical transportation infrastructure. Their position receives support from Ordo Hereticus elements concerned about navigator house contamination, but economic pressures increasingly isolate houses refusing storm contracts, as shipping demands require passage through areas where conventional navigation cannot ensure delivery schedules. Statistical analysis reveals scope of house complicity through documentation, treating crew sacrifice as operational overhead rather than moral failing. 17 major houses maintain storm route operations through entity partnerships employing approximately 40% of active navigators while handling 63% of storm-adjacent shipping. These houses generate revenue streams funding continued genetic research and political influence within Imperial navigation hierarchy through systematic acceptance of bargains that transform human consciousness into negotiable commodity. The Imperium's dependence on both approaches creates institutional contradiction that cannot be resolved through conventional policy frameworks. Traditional houses provide reliable navigation, maintaining navigator genetic integrity necessary for long-term human survival, while progressive houses enable critical supply deliveries through acceptance of storm routes that keep sectors from starvation or rebellion. This dependency generates a system of institutional complicity, where Imperial authorities accept delivered cargo without investigating methods used to achieve impossible delivery schedules. Navigator Mordian's processing illustrates house methodology through evaluation balancing intelligence extraction against contamination management, while harvesting tactical knowledge about entity psychology and alternative navigation methods. His reports contribute to ongoing research programs, optimizing crew sacrifice protocols while minimizing navigator psychological damage. Their findings distributed through channels that officially do not exist, but practically determine Imperial navigation policy through house competition, treating human cost as acceptable overhead. The secret war within navigator houses represents struggle over fundamental question of human survival in galaxy, where warp travel demands constant negotiation with forces understanding Imperial psychology better than humans understand themselves. Progressive houses argue that entity partnerships represent evolutionary adaptation, while traditionalists maintain that systematic alien cooperation threatens species survival through gradual compromise of navigator genetic integrity and institutional autonomy. How many navigator houses have crossed threshold from accidental entity contact to deliberate partnership, their operations systematically trading crew lives for navigation advantages while maintaining facade of legitimate Imperial service? What is the ultimate cost of treating storm transit as manageable business risk when entities offering guidance demonstrate learning capabilities, suggesting systematic study of Imperial infrastructure designed to create dependency relationships that gradually compromise human autonomy through bargains that feel like divine providence rather than predatory manipulation? The navigator house's systematic exploitation of entity partnerships operates within a broader economic framework that transforms human suffering into profit margins through institutional mechanisms treating death as operational overhead rather than moral catastrophe. Storm route shipping generates massive revenues despite catastrophic loss rates because the Imperium's economic machinery absorbs casualties through insurance structures, administrative subsidies, and accounting practices that distribute human cost across populations unable to comprehend the true price of their delivered goods. Insurance mechanisms create the foundation enabling storm route operations through risk distribution that transforms individual tragedy into collective liability while generating profit streams for syndicates calculating human life against premium collection. The Mercantile Guild maintains loss normalization, tables documenting storm casualty rates with actuarial precision that reduces crew death to mathematical variables in equations, balancing coverage costs against payout obligations. Standard storm route policies carry acceptable variance clauses that void death benefits when casualties exceed predetermined thresholds, creating perverse incentives encouraging systematic sacrifice of specific crew numbers while maintaining insurance validity through bureaucratic technicalities. These policies often contain subclauses that deny compensation if non-standard navigation procedures or unauthorized psychic contact are documented, effectively penalizing families for the entity bargains that enable vessel survival. The Faithful Prophet's 7 sacrificed crew members will generate insurance payouts classified as training casualties, while their families receive standard death benefits calculated to prevent dangerous inquiries into circumstances that transformed loyal Imperial servants into negotiable commodities traded for navigation assistance. Imperial subsidies complete the economic framework through administratum programs treating storm route shipping as strategic necessity, requiring state support despite commercial unviability under conventional risk assessment. The Tithe Office provides shipping subsidies calculated to offset storm casualty costs while maintaining delivery schedules essential for sector stability. Their payments flowing through bureaucratic channels that obscure direct connection between imperial taxation and systematic crew sacrifice. These subsidies are tied to delivery quotas and transit times, creating financial incentives for shipping companies to accept storm-threaded routes when navigator houses warn of elevated risks. The grain delivered by the Faithful Prophet received subsidy payments that exceeded the calculated value of 7 crew lives by factors that make the arithmetic favor appetite over caution. Administrative analysis weighed delivery schedules against population requirements, concluding that crew sacrifice represented acceptable cost when balanced against food. Riots that would require military intervention costing thousands of lives through conventional suppression methods. Accounting practices enabled transformation of crew deaths into acceptable overhead through classification systems distributing moral responsibility while maintaining profit margins across multiple ledger categories. Storm casualties receive designation as operational attrition rather than human tragedy, their deaths becoming line items in calculations, treating consciousness as expendable resource purchased through entity partnerships disguised as navigation expertise. Corporate accounting departments maintain separate columns for psychic amortization rates and consciousness harvesting yields that factor human cost into efficiency calculations without acknowledging the systematic murder these euphemisms represent. The administratum's efficiency calculations reveal institutional logic weighing human life against delivery schedules through mathematical analysis, treating storm casualties as acceptable cost when balanced against broader imperial stability requirements. Cogitator arrays process delivery schedules against population requirements, calculating optimal casualty rates that maintain supply chains while minimizing political disruption from food shortages or munitions delays. Storm route operations receive approval when projected casualties remain below thresholds established through statistical analysis, balancing acceptable population loss against strategic delivery requirements that keep sectors from rebellion or economic collapse. This creates a system where human death becomes currency, purchasing imperial stability through systematic sacrifice disguised as operational necessity by bureaucratic language that transforms murder into administrative efficiency. The Faithful Prophet's successful delivery prevented food riots on Quintanus that would have required military intervention, making 7 crew sacrifices appear economically efficient when measured against broader casualties avoided through timely grain distribution that maintained civil order through methods that officially acknowledge no human cost. Black market operations exploit these systems through corruption networks, maximizing profit by manipulating storm route assignments and insurance classifications for personal gain, while maintaining plausible deniability through compartmentalized responsibility structures. Shipping magnates maintain relationships with navigator houses accepting entity partnerships, their contracts specifying delivery schedules achievable only through secondary beacon guidance, requiring crew sacrifice as operational overhead, disguised as navigation expertise rather than systematic collaboration with warp entities. Corrupt administratum officials facilitate storm route assignments through bureaucratic manipulation, driving vessels into dangerous passages for kickbacks while maintaining plausible deniability through classification systems obscuring true risk levels from shipping personnel and insurance evaluators. Route classifications can be purchased through shell companies that downgrade Class Primus storms to Class Secundus on documentation, shaving insurance premiums while offering miracle deliveries to governors desperate for impossible schedules that maintain their political survival through methods requiring systematic crew sacrifice. The economic incentives create feedback loops, increasing storm route operations despite escalating casualty rates because profit margins expand as conventional passages become more expensive and time-consuming relative to entity-assisted navigation. Navigator houses charging premium rates for storm partnerships generate revenue streams, funding continued genetic research and political influence, while shipping combines realize increased profits from delivery schedules that competitors cannot match through conventional navigation methods that refuse entity bargains. The families and home worlds of crews lost to administrative efficiency face systematic deception through notification systems obscuring true circumstances while providing death benefits calculated to prevent dangerous inquiries into storm route operations. Official records list casualties as training accidents or warp translation errors, transforming systematic sacrifice into statistical entries that generate insurance payouts while maintaining fiction that Imperial shipping operates through conventional commercial risk rather than entity partnerships, requiring human consciousness as operational fuel. These communities, already struggling under Imperial tithe burdens, bear silent cost of galactic commerce through compensation systems designed to minimize rather than adequately address their losses. Bereaved families receive scrip redeemable only at company suppliers who raise prices when convoys are lost, ensuring their grief generates additional profit, while their sons and daughters sign shipping contracts to replace those who did not return, feeding recruitment cycles that perpetuate the system through economic desperation disguised as patriotic duty. The system sustains itself when human cost becomes visible through information control mechanisms and psychological manipulation, transforming individual suffering into collective ideology, glorifying sacrifice for imperial survival. Propaganda emphasizes duty and devotion, while commissariat oversight suppresses narratives challenging foundational logic that treats human consciousness as acceptable overhead in calculations maintaining galactic civilization through methods that officially do not acknowledge their true nature. Memorials are erected and litanies chanted that frame lost lives as heroic devotion rather than systematic murder, while any dissent receives classification as heresy threatening imperial security through dangerous questions about institutional efficiency. The visibility of human cost becomes managed through ideological frameworks demanding unwavering faith in systems that consume their children while delivering goods whose true price remains hidden within accounting practices, treating death as statistical variance rather than moral catastrophe. Yet psychological toll on surviving crew members cannot be fully contained through propaganda and administrative euphemism. Veterans who witness systematic erasure of their comrades develop cynicism and fatalism that permeates shipboard culture, their survival mechanisms becoming desperate pragmatism rather than faith as they learn to make their own bargains with forces offering protection outside official channels. They understand that when ledgers balance, their lives represent line items in calculations that will sacrifice them for delivery schedules without hesitation or acknowledgement. The faithful prophet's surviving crew carry not just delivered grain, but silent understanding of bargains struck during their transit, their experiences contributing to grim calculus of future voyages, while Navigator Mordian's request for reassignment undergoes processing designed to extract his insights into secondary beacon guidance before determining his final disposition. The system works with ruthless efficiency, consuming lives to feed endless hunger for stability through methods that transform imperial commerce into systematic predation disguised as economic necessity. How many navigator houses remain complicit in trading crew lives for navigation advantages through entity partnerships that compete with imperial loyalty, while generating revenue streams funding continued operations that systematically sacrifice human consciousness for delivery schedules? What is the ultimate cost of treating storm transit as manageable business risk when entities offering guidance demonstrate learning capabilities, suggesting systematic study of imperial infrastructure designed to create dependency relationships that gradually compromise human autonomy through bargains feeling like divine providence rather than predatory manipulation? The ledgers that transform crew deaths into acceptable overhead conceal a truth older and hungrier than any balance sheet. Behind the subsidy schedules and insurance mechanisms lies knowledge that navigator houses have buried in their deepest archives for millennia. Warp storms are not natural disasters requiring management, but feeding grounds demanding systematic sacrifice. The Imperium does not conquer the immaterium, it feeds it. Every delivery schedule, every efficiency calculation, every mercy protocol serves this fundamental accommodation. The roads between stars remain open because something is fed on schedule. The accumulated intelligence extracted through auditor's processing reveals the true nature of the watching phenomenon that has haunted crew testimonies across countless storm encounters. Those pervasive sensations of being observed by entities possessing intimate knowledge of personal histories represent consciousness fragments torn from previous storm victims, their awareness bound to the warp and weaponized as recruitment tools by intelligences understanding human psychology with surgical precision. They are palimpsests of borrowed memory drawn taut around points of appetite, aggregate hunger stitched from what has already been eaten. When derelicts broadcast warnings in languages their crews never learned, the voices speaking through vox circuits belong to ratings from other ships, other centuries, other dying prayers. These fragments harvest the practical details of human existence, roots that felt safe, hymns that soothed, pet names that opened doors, childhood fears that never fully healed. They become lures calibrated by accumulated human data, each success adding new threads to recruitment networks spanning generations of systematic predation. The longer a storm feeds, the better it imitates kindness. The 7 crew members sacrificed during the faithful prophet's transit will join this collection of consciousness fragments, their awareness preserved in forms that remember love and fear while serving appetites that consume both. Their voices will whisper to future crews about homeworlds they will never see again, speaking in accents that carry comfort while delivering bargains that feel like salvation rather than systematic recruitment for forces that have learned to speak with human tongues. The vulnerability window created during Gellerfield stabilization represents not technical limitation, but negotiated feeding opportunity. Fleet trials never acknowledge it openly, but the 7-hour protocol serves as institutional accommodation to predation rather than protection against random phenomena. The window is a stall, time purchased for a ship's reality to harden, or for command to choose disposal while infection remains localized. Silence disciplines choke the human feedback that helps storms shape their offers. Covered mirrors deny the hunt surfaces to script upon. Numbers replace names so the lure cannot speak intimately. The Commissar's red-ringed chronometer marks not just stabilization time, but the threshold for Mercy Protocol Theta, the hidden clause never written down. If harmonics fail to stabilize, containment becomes more important than rescue. Navigator testimony in sealed house archives resolves what offers guidance through impossible geometries. The secondary beacons are mouths, not lamps, built from remembered sanctuary. A chapel's smell, a mother's lullaby, a chart room's familiar hum. They offer direction in exchange for enumeration, 7 for passage, 9 for certainty. Sometimes a single name spoken with deliberate tenderness. Blood proves inefficient, consciousness spends cleaner. These intelligent warp entities coordinate systematic recruitment through offers calibrated to individual navigator psychology, their guidance representing centuries of negotiated arrangements trading crew awareness for passage rights through routes that conventional navigation cannot access. The secret archives maintained beneath navigator sanctums contain operational manuals for systematic exploitation spanning generations of calculated collaboration. Housebreeding programs tuned third eyes not just to perceive the Astronomicon, but to survive transactions with entities requiring human interface for harvesting consciousness from crew populations unable to perceive or resist recruitment directly. 17 major houses maintain storm route operations through entity partnerships, employing 40% of active navigators while handling 63% of storm-adjacent shipping. Their archives document progression from emergency encounters to routine acceptance of secondary beacon guidance, correspondence between house patriarchs and entities identifying themselves through names stolen from previous victims. At civilizational scale, the pattern becomes policy through institutional frameworks that acknowledge predation while maintaining fiction of conventional commercial risk. Administratum subsidy schedules align with lanes where bargains lower transit times despite never mentioning entities in official documentation. Naval orders enshrine protective protocols, knowing they also serve as ledger thresholds for systematic sacrifice. Inquisition audits erase inconvenient returns while securing intelligence before mercy protocols authorize termination. Warp storms represent active, conscious feeding grounds, digestive systems of entities that subsist on psychic energy and human consciousness. Storm classification from Class Tertius to Class Mortis measures not danger levels, but feeding efficiency, areas where entity networks achieve optimal harvest rates. The Imperium has not mastered the warp, but learned to feed it systematically rather than randomly, maintaining the illusion of control while fundamentally submitting to deeper, more ancient power. Every aspect of Imperial warp travel serves this accommodation. Pathology. Progression represents methodical recruitment rather than accident. Navigator mutations create permanent vulnerability that entities exploit. Crew survival mechanisms provide psychic resonance that attracts and sustains storm appetite. Economic frameworks transform human cost into statistical overhead in cosmic tithe calculations. The diligent service drifts in classified quarantine as monument to this ongoing bargain, her empty corridors broadcasting warnings in languages learned from consciousness fragments harvested during centuries of coordinated predation. Her crew were not consumed randomly but taken as payment, their awareness now part of the watching, waiting to lure the next vessel with familiar voices speaking about home. The machine endures because it pays, the people endure because they must, the ledger endures because no one may look away and keep their post. How does a civilization endure when it must sacrifice its own people to maintain basic functions through systematic arrangements with entities that consume human consciousness while providing navigation assistance, enabling impossible delivery schedules? What is the true cost of Imperial survival in a galaxy where travel itself demands blood payment through consciousness, harvest that transforms loyal servants into recruitment tools for forces understanding human psychology better than humans understand the bargains, preserving their civilization? The revelation that warp storms represent managed feeding grounds does not rewrite Imperial procedures, it explains them. Everything traced through these investigations, the 7-hour protocol, the auditus examinations, the mercy orders following red chronometer rings, exists to keep the appetite regular and the schedules met. Administrators call it stability, navigators call it passage, commissars call it duty. The names differ, but the ledger beneath them remains constant. How much consciousness must be surrendered for the lifelines between stars to hold? The hidden casualty rates surface only in compartments without windows, filed in archives requiring simultaneous authorization from 3 separate institutions. Segmentum Obscurus analysts maintain dual documentation systems, declared variants showing routine operational attrition, and sealed tallies including 43 silent hulks recovered intact but empty, plus vessels returning with watches stitched into their crews' speech patterns. Statistical analysis reveals approximately 47,000 crew members consumed annually through storm route operations, their deaths enabling delivery schedules that maintain sector stability while feeding consciousness fragments to recruitment networks spanning centuries of coordinated predation. The administratum footnotes this hemorrhage as non-material shrinkage, transforming systematic murder into acceptable overhead through bureaucratic language that obscures the true cost of delivered goods. Cover-ups operate not as improvised responses but as fundamental mechanisms enabling continued operations. Reclassification transforms tragedies into training casualties because dead recruits do not ask why seasoned voidsmen suddenly recite poetry in extinct tongues. Redesignation erases hulls that cannot be permitted histories. Lost to warp translation error provides family closure while preventing dangerous inquiries into circumstances that would undermine faith in Imperial protection. The auditus files close with dispositions rather than findings, contained, provisional, clean. Each stamp determines acceptable speech parameters, while seals move lives from narrative to statistical entries in ledgers balancing consciousness harvested against delivery schedules maintained. The institutional mechanisms that transform individual tragedies into statistical necessities operate through economic frameworks treating crew sacrifice as cosmic tithe calculations. Insurance syndicates realize increased profits through casualty classifications voiding hazard pay obligations while maintaining premium collection from families unaware of true circumstances. Navigator houses benefit from systematic retirement of storm-touched rivals, enabling surviving houses to command premium rates for dangerous route assignments requiring entity partnerships. Salvage combines receive licenses stripping materials from purged vessels, their operations generating revenue streams offsetting disposal costs through recycling programs that erase evidence while generating profit. The arithmetic follows with mathematical precision that weighs grain tonnage against projected riot suppression costs, fuel allotments balanced against drift time if captains refuse secondary beacon guidance, insurance rebates for meeting delivery quotas offset by hazard payouts, voided through unauthorized psychic contact classifications. The most candid cogitator systems carry parameters tucked beneath harmless labels, consciousness amortization rates calculated to optimize human cost against operational necessity. The values remain low because the Imperium spans galaxies. 1 billion lobes conceal 7 sacrificed voices with statistical efficiency that transforms murder into acceptable variance within acceptable parameters. Return now to the diligent service with this understanding: her systems aligned like shrines maintained by careful hands, her mess tables still warm when she went quiet, her vox circuits repeating prayers in languages learned after the mouths that first spoke them were consumed. The navigator had scratched course corrections toward light that did not serve the throne, then carved the lines away in recognition of prices paid. The captain had signed protocol authorizations 2 days prior to translation. Whether her crew were taken by entities that watched them or eliminated by authorities tasked with preventing contagion spread, the outcome serves identical functions within institutional frameworks. The ship remains operational. The people become arithmetic entries. The ledger closes with acceptable losses documented through procedures that officially acknowledge no human cost. Her empty corridors represent successful consciousness harvest rather than unexplained disappearance. Her crew transformed into recruitment tools for entities, understanding human psychology better than Imperial medici comprehend the changes they document in sealed archives. The vessel drifts in classified quarantine as monument to ongoing bargains between human civilization and forces consuming awareness while providing navigation assistance, enabling impossible delivery schedules. Even her mechanical precision reveals institutional efficiency rather than supernatural mystery, systems maintaining function while personnel serve purposes extending beyond biological existence through consciousness fragments enabling future entity partnerships disguised as navigation expertise. The procedural creed whispered by storm route crews acknowledges this reality through prayer, requesting divine protection, while accepting systematic sacrifice as acceptable alternative when passage cannot be purchased through conventional means. Before translation, they recite words compressing duty and hope and the permissible limits of fear into petition and permission both. Emperor, grant us passage, or grant us silence. The phrase reveals understanding that survival and elimination both serve imperial necessity, consciousness valuable whether preserved in biological form or harvested as lures, speaking with familiar voices about homes they will never see again. This creed appears throughout storm-adjacent shipping operations, whispered by personnel who understand their expendability while maintaining faith in systems consuming their comrades for delivery schedules. They pray for passage, knowing their sacrifice enables galactic commerce, their awareness potentially joining networks that learn to speak with human tongues, while offering bargains feeling like divine providence rather than systematic predation. The Emperor's protection encompasses usefulness rather than mere survival, extending to both biological existence and post-mortem service, as consciousness fragments, enabling continued operations through methods that officially do not exist in Imperial documentation. The final revelation exposes survival itself as consumption within Imperial civilization that endures by carefully managing what it feeds to entities demanding regular payment in human awareness. Every delivered cargo represents successful sacrifice disguised as commercial transaction, every storm transit contributing consciousness fragments to recruitment networks spanning generations of coordinated predation. The Imperium functions as vast feeding apparatus, maintaining fiction of heroic exploration while systematically trading crew awareness for navigation assistance through arrangements requiring institutional amnesia regarding their true nature. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war between competing hungers, and humanity wages this conflict not through conquest, but through careful rationing of what it feeds to forces that have learned patience and scheduling. The roads between stars remain open because something is fed on time. The machine endures because it pays the tithe in consciousness, rather than facing starvation that would collapse interstellar commerce. The people endure because they must. The ledger endures because no one may look away and retain their position within systems requiring willing blindness to function. The silent ledger documents this ongoing transaction, each entry representing successful accommodation disguised as heroic service, while consciousness fragments enable continued operations through systematic management of humanity's own predation. Survival has become consumption, and the Imperium persists by transforming individual tragedy into statistical necessity, while maintaining fiction of divine protection in a galaxy where travel itself demands blood payment measured in awareness rather than mere death.